All right, guys, welcome back to the MindMate podcast. I'm very, very, very excited about today's show. I have three wonderful gentlemen with me. They are the founders of terror management theory, I suppose. And as all of you know, as someone who loves to talk about existential ideas, philosophy, and so on, you will know that I have almost bored you to death about the research that these guys with me today conducted. So gentlemen, it's such an honor and a privilege for me to sit with you all. Perhaps if we go around the room and we just do a short introduction from each of you. So I've got Jeff closest to me down here. Jeff, could we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually just retired, so I'm a
Oh, congratulations.
region. Thank you. I'm a Regents Professor Emeritus at the University of Arizona, and yeah, I'm still working. I don't know. Retirement hasn't changed anything for me yet, so I don't know if it's going to change or not. But anyway, that's me, and I've been buddies with these guys since 1978. We've been working together since then. We were grad students together at the University of Kansas, so that's how we kind of got started in our collaboration.
I imagine that retirement would be almost a blessing and a curse for you at the moment because like you've got all this spare time, but it's like, well, what do I do with it now?
Uh, yeah, no. Tom just told me what he got on his plate, and I'm like, what's going on here? We're supposed to. I think we all set up. We wanted to do it sort of transition to being really retired by taking on projects and still having students and stuff, and it sort of backfired. It's like now we're like, why am I still reading stuff I don't want to be reading? Even though, why am I doing all this thing? And particularly, because we're retiring at the end of spring semester. So in the summer, we don't teach.
Mm.
And so the big change is we won't be teaching. But yeah, I think, I got a chapter coming in tomorrow, another one hopefully next week coming in from Tom. So we're still pretty busy, even though Tom and I are technically retired.
That's good. I think it's good to stay busy, right? I think you can go a bit
Yeah,
crazy if
yes,
you don't. Nice one. Well, thank you, Jeff. So good to have you here. And Sheldon.
I'm Sheldon Solomon. I teach at Skidmore College in upstate New York. And as Jeff said, we go back to our graduate student days in the 1970s at the University of Kansas. And so we started out together. Here we are wrapping it up pretty much together. So it's nice to be here.
Wow, that's actually really symbolic. I didn't think of it like that. That's really, really cool. Wow, awesome. And Tom, finally, first thing, great name. Have to put it out there.
Yeah, sure. Love Tom's. Yeah, I'm Tom Pyszczynski. I'm also on the edge of retirement. I'm officially retired at the end of June. I've been a professor at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs for 25 or so years. And yeah, right now we're just wrapping things up, finishing theses with students, and kind of my hope is that you know in the next month or so we'll kind of get those things squared away, and then who knows what happens next. I've been really kind of conscious and intentional about not making plans to sort of see what
Mm.
happens.
I love that. I love that. I think it's so good to do that. I think in this day and age, it's quite hard to do that almost. There's just
Yeah.
constant bombardment and technology, and it's like, go do this, do this. It's hard to sort of say no. I think, well, thank you so much, guys, once again for being here. I've got a quote here from the book, The Worm at the Core. It is the twin motives of affirming the correctness of our worldviews and demonstrating our personal worth combined to protect us from the uniquely human fear of inevitable death. I thought that was a really good one to start off with because I remember from reading the book that you guys you guys all met. In fact, I'll bring you into it rather than just sort of speaking at you. Late 70s, right? So Ernest Becker only died sort of 5 or 6 years prior to that. That's correct?
Yeah.
That's correct in
Real close.
terms of when we met, but we didn't discover Ernest Becker's work until the early 80s. Sheldon could speak to when he first stumbled upon Becker's writing. So he had been dead, I think, probably about 8, 9 years when Sheldon discovered his work and then told us about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my sense, even though at this point, who knows? But that's yeah, I'm with you, Jeff, on the timing. There was the early 80s, pretty sure. Well, I know I stumbled on Becker's books in the Skidmore Library. You know, there's some possibility that there were already people at Kansas that we didn't know that were aware of Becker, but not us. And, I thought his stuff was amazing. And my recollection, this was pre-email. We had to use the phone. I called up Jeff and Tom, and I was like, I think this fucking guy is amazing that he has poignantly profound answers to the questions that we were working on. And then on top of that, really uh, was quite ambitious in his effort to formulate a general account of human behavior that we found pretty compelling.
I think I think it was for me, and Sheldon, I'd love to follow it up with a question. So I came across The Denial of Death very shortly after I read Joseph Campbell's work. So to read a book that completely undermined or sort of added an extra layer of depth to another book that to me was already so deep was really in itself existentially destabilizing. You know, this idea that the hero myth in itself is a sort of repressed thing that's going on to avoid the deepest fear that we all have. Um, there was a part where I sort of shattered my perception of self for a long time. It's one of the beautiful things about reading a book. But tell me why, Sheldon, the book spoke to you so much, and then why you felt compelled to call Jeff and Tom.
Well, for me, it was two things. One, it was just very personal when Becker just cut to the chase in the first paragraph of the Denial of Death, and just pointed out that it was basically the central cog in our psychic machinery. In my gut, I was like, well, that at least explains me to me. I've been disinclined to die since the day I realized it was inevitable. And I think I was around 8 years old. But then on the academic slash intellectual front, um, it was also the questions that we were working on, Jeff and Tom and I, trying to explore the psychological functions of self-esteem and trying to figure out from Jeff's work in his days before we all got together to try and come up with a psychological understanding of the nature of prejudice. And so that's what excited me. Plus, the guy wrote in a way that, now I'll shut up and defer to Tom and Jeff, but most of the stuff that we wrote and read were like non-pharmacological interventions for insomnia. So here was a guy not only being who had awesome ideas, but who had the audacity to express them in ways that we found compelling and convincing.
Yeah, yeah. And Jeff, and then if we could go to Tom after, but yeah, Jeff, what was that like for you coming across Ernest Becker?
Well, yeah, it was life-changing for sure. When Sheldon called me, I said, okay, that's great. And then I went about my business. And Sheldon, he knows me, so he mailed me the book. He wasn't going to count on me to go find the book. So he mailed me The Denial of Death. And then I made a mistake of actually reading it. And, it was like, it ruined my life in certain ways. But yeah, I found it, profoundly true to my experiences. Like, I remember like Sunday nights for some reason as a kid. It seemed like, school's coming on Monday and you got nothing going on and you're just contemplating no longer existing. And so the way Becca writes, he kind of gets you to think about these things you maybe haven't thought about in a long time because you've buried them in your own ways. So it was profound. Interestingly, though, I think if we had stumbled upon him in the late 70s, we either wouldn't have done anything or we would have tried to have done something and we'd now be homeless or working at McDonald's. to this day. When Sheldon ran into Becker, we already were professors. We were assistant professors. We had jobs. We had ongoing research programs. And one of the funny things about terror management theory and the development of that was Becker was so different than what we were reading in the journals and book chapters and books that we had been reading as grad students, that we didn't even necessarily connect it to our empirical enterprise initially. We just saw that it was a way to tie things together, to understand conformity and obedience and aggression and intergroup conflict and the striving for self-esteem, things that we had, there's empirical evidence for all these things. We thought it tied all of this together. We started using our teaching, and then we just wanted to write a paper and say, hey, social psychologists, hey, academic psychologists, well, you should be attending to what this guy has to say. And we just wanted to put it together.
That's right.
To point out that it already explained a lot of stuff that we were studying. It wasn't so much of, oh, here's something we can follow empirically. And it was only because of the stubbornness of academic psychology not to consider these ideas that we were forced to think hard about how could we derive some testable hypotheses from these ideas, so we can get them to be taken seriously within academic psychology and get the work into journals, into scientific journals, so then it can have some impact. Because Becker was in some ways a little bit tossed aside because what he was doing was so interdisciplinary that it wasn't straight ahead anthropology and it wasn't straight ahead psychology or philosophy or sociology. It was all of those things. But he was kind of falling through the cracks. So when I first read it, I wasn't thinking, oh, here's a great empirical direction for us. It was just, this stuff makes sense. Let's just get it out there.
That makes a lot of sense. Yep. And Tom, tell me about your first experience reading the book and what that was like.
Sure. My experience was really different from Sheldon and Jeff's. I was sort of the last to join the party. They were encouraging me to read this, and they talk about it. I think this sounds kind of interesting, but I don't know. I need to get a job. And anyway, I was reading the book, and I was hating it, and I was arguing with pretty much every page. And the basic thought was, it just seemed implausible to me that the fear of death would be affecting things that didn't seem related to the fear of death. And I found myself, as I said, arguing with every page. And I don't know, about halfway through the book, one night I woke up in the middle of the night, and I woke up arguing with it. I thought, it just struck me as it's kind of interesting that I'm so pissed off about this, and so so looking for reasons to dismiss it. And I was also kind of, I was in a bit of a bind because my buddies wanted to do this thing and work with it, and I felt like, well, I kind of wanted to go along with them, but I just wasn't buying it. But then it hit me like, well, it is interesting that this is annoying me so much, and I'm finding so much to disagree with. And at some point it struck me like, well, yeah, maybe that's informative. Maybe that's a light bulb sort of thing. And it would be pretty strange if people knew they were going to die and it didn't affect them. So at that point, we sort of all kind of joined in, and we're writing a chapter about the need for self-esteem. And as I recall, the idea was we were going to just use Becker's ideas as a framework for that chapter, sort of like, I don't know what they thought of, but I was thinking it was sort of a one-off kind of deal. But as it came together, it was more and more interesting and made more and more sense. And then the reactions that we got to it were pretty extreme. I mean, some people really, really resonated with it and loved it, and others hated it, kind of, and to some extent, within our group, there was that reaction initially as well. And I think that intense reaction that we got was sort of a challenge and inspiring us to try to find a way of communicating this in the language of academic psychology.
One of the things that I think I'm always trying to sort of play devil's advocate to my my positions. And I think one of the things I can very much align with what you're saying there, Tom. One of the things that frustrated me about it initially was it almost felt like the sort of God of the gaps fallacy, where it's like if I was speaking to someone that was a sort of staunch admirer of terror management theory, and I was trying to have a conversation with them, and I was trying to sort of debunk or play devil's advocate to it. Anytime I would say that I'm frustrated about something, that I felt like they could say, well, see, that there is an example of why you're repressing this thing. It almost felt to me like that sort of God of the gaps fallacy, where it's like, because we don't have an answer, there's God. So I can really empathize with that. But I'm wondering, have you guys thought, I'm sure you guys have had discussions about that, sort of trying to play devil's advocate to this theory that, for me anyway, as a very deep admirer of your work, seems to be very, very spot on.
It's been an argument, dialogue, discussion from day one with
Yeah.
other psychologists and people in other fields. And I don't know. I think we've sort of, it's kind of easy to say, well, they don't like it because they're suppressing their fear of death. And that might well be right. But I think we always thought that was kind of a bad tactic for debating and discussing it, to say, well, you just don't see the brilliance of this because you're too afraid of it. Yeah, that's not very persuasive, even if it might be right.
Yep. And Sheldon, what's your thought? Because I heard you on Julius's podcast, actually, just coincidentally. I think I said to you, I went to school with Julius. But I think with Lex Friedman as well, he was sort of asking you to stillman Jordan Peterson's ideas about it not being the central, deepest fear. But yeah, what are your views on sort of stillmanning the other side?
It's a good question. Like, I don't remember. Tom and Jeff, maybe you'll jump in, because I may be hallucinating, but Jack Bram, our mentor, at one point said, look, this is either like one of the coolest, most profound notions that might be foundational for subsequent psychological discourse, or you might be right, but trite, that you're just making this categorical statement about reality that you're purporting explains everything. Maybe Jeff, jump in if that makes any sense, because that's one of the criticisms, or Tom too, of our enterprise. It's like, yeah, you're saying death is involved with anything and everything, and that's either trivial or unfalsifiable.
Yeah, or almost like it's too good to be true.
But we're saying more than that.
Yeah.
There's nuance and subtlety to it. We're saying that the fear of death is an important driver of the pursuit of meaning and self-esteem,
Exactly.
and also influences our need for relatedness with other people. So we're not just saying, so it sort of specifies, these sort of bulwarks of psychological security, self-esteem, meaning that we get from our worldviews and what we get from other people, that are influenced by the fear of death. One way I like to put it is that we think the fear of death plays an important role in almost everything people do, but it doesn't fully explain everything people do either. I don't think we've ever claimed this is all there is.
Yeah, it doesn't fully explain anything.
Important.
Right.
Go
It
ahead,
doesn't
Jeff.
fully explain anything, but it plays a role in virtually any significant aspect of human behavior, is what we would argue. But you're certainly right, Tom, that when we proposed it, part of the problem was nobody wants to think about death.
Right.
Right. There's no doubt about that, because we go to conferences and, oh, those are those death guys. I mean, it's literally stigmatizing.
Yes.
But the other part of it was, it seemed like we were being very imperialistic, and we're like saying, no, everything else everybody talks about in psychology is nonsense, and that wasn't our intention. And we tried to be very careful in the way we wrote about it in our 91 advances paper, which was the first full presentation of the theory, that we're not saying these other things aren't important. We're saying that there's an underlying motivation that's playing a role in a lot of the phenomenon that other social psychologists had been studying and demonstrating various kinds of interesting sort of mini theories about, that there's something that ties these things together, at least to some extent. And that was this underlying fear of death, which requires us to sustain our sense that we're living in a meaningful reality. So we live in a symbolic reality that helps protect us from the underlying fear. And that's that's what Becker was saying, and we think that's a profound insight in terms of the fighting against ourselves. We're in a field where you don't have to fight against yourself. You just throw an idea out, and if sharks come and attack it, and we welcome that because we were trained how to deal with that. And so when we started doing research, people are like, well, what about this? What about that? Well, we had control conditions. We'll manipulate another. We were responsive to all of that, and that helped advance the science of it, which is fine. That's the way it should work.
Exactly.
And so we kind of let other people help us think harder about how to empirically assess these things in a way that makes a more compelling case. And we're sort of still doing that. I mean, that's this ongoing process of science, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Without debate and criticism, science wouldn't exist, or it wouldn't work. Science is a communal thing where someone puts an idea out, provides some evidence for it, and then other people, their role is to challenge it. And then our role is to come back and answer those challenges, and people challenges again. It goes on forever until, well, it never, ultimately it never stops. And ideally, that will get us closer to the truth,
Yeah,
to
you should
reality.
stumble to the truth, right?
We're not saying this is reality. This is absolute truth.
Right. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to bring in, just sort of my experience working as a therapist with this, because I work specifically with sort of existential therapy. That's why I love you guys drawing on Irvin Yalom, just as like an idol to me. One of the things that I can't help but notice, and this is something that I was really interested to hear your guys' perspectives on, was that when we talk about a death, when we talk about so much of what motivates a human being is because of this sort of suppression or repression of the fear of death. I think people often think of death in a purely physical notion, like literally the ending of the body. Whereas from my experience, death is at least in a therapeutic setting, so much more aligned with the psychological death of the ego. And when I was reading The Worm at the Core, that really spoke to me, this idea that death isn't only just the ending of our life, but it's more of an existential thing that goes on, and we attach ourselves to worldviews, political parties, agendas, and all that sort of stuff to maintain our ego, like the living ego, our psychological identity, as opposed to that part dying. So I wondered if you guys see this all when people are sort of not necessarily attacking your work, but sort of critiquing it. Do you ever feel that there's a conflation sometimes with a physical death as opposed to a psychological death? Perhaps, Sheldon, if we could bring you in.
Yeah, again, with the understanding that Tom and Jeff will correct me on the details here, but yeah, my recollection is that there's a footnote in Becker's The Denial of Death pointing out that death is a complex, multi-dimensional construct. And we have Israeli colleagues, I believe it was Victor Florian and Mario Mikulincer back in the day before they teamed up with another one of our buddies and colleagues, Gilad Hirschberger, and they honed in on that idea and developed a multi-dimensional death anxiety scale. And then based on our work, what they demonstrated, well, it's based on an extension of our work in coordination with Becker's notion that death is a multidimensional construct. To make a short story long, different people have different conceptions of death. For some, it is all about your body rotting until a worm's crawling out of your eye socket. Other folks It is a more cerebral concern about one's selfhood. Other folks primarily concerned about relationships, and I can't remember how many different factors were in this scale, but they then demonstrated empirically that that our mortality salience effects are peculiar to a given individual's actual concerns. And so if their conception of death is about their body decomposing, they didn't respond defensively when other dimensions of death were made salient. Am I hallucinating, or was that anything close? Jeff or Tom?
Yeah, just run with it. Yeah, there's some confounds in what they were doing and
Yeah,
their
well, of course.
conclusions. We don't have to get into that here. But yeah, that's certainly what they were arguing. Yeah, for sure, I think.
That's really interesting. So it's actually like the ending of their life doesn't bring on, or doesn't sort of, isn't, what would you say, isn't correlated with bolstering their ego, by becoming more attached to a political party or an agenda or something, some way to boost their self-esteem, in other words.
Along the lines of death being this complex concept, even I don't know, to some extent, I suspect the three of us might think about it a little bit differently. And, we're not on the same page in absolutely everything. My take is that, ultimately what it does boil down to physical death, and that, the meaning we get from our worldview and the value we get from our self-esteem is protecting us from the fear that results from knowing that physically our lives are going to end. So when our self-esteem is damaged by, I don't know, a major failure, a breakup of a relationship, or our meaning system is damaged by realizing that if a former president gets convicted, it makes him more popular with half the country. It's kind of shattering, our sense that the world makes sense, right? So you could call that a death of our meaning system. I think that's I think that's using death as a metaphor rather than focusing on, the more basic meaning of it. So metaphorically, we might have a death of meaning, a death of our value, death of a relationship. And I think we might think of it that way because it's kind of similar. We're using it as a metaphor. We're using death to help us understand what happens when we lose meaning or self-esteem or connection. But the way I don't know, I think the way I don't know, I think the way we've always thought about it was that ultimately it boils down to these things, our worldview, self-esteem, and so on, is protecting us from the fear that results from knowing that we're physically going to die.
Right.
You guys, is that what do you guys think about that? Is that what you guys think?
Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that, what you could lose a loved one, you can lose a sense of meaning, you can lose your faith in America, or whatever country you're from. But you can regain that. You can regain meaning, right? You can shift and find a different basis of meaning. You can find a different basis of self-worth. You can come back from every death except your actual death.
Yeah.
And that, it's that finality that of course makes death particularly disturbing. And the loss of everything. So the way I look at it is, it doesn't matter what you care about, from a scientific, sort of atheistic, I suppose, perspective, you're done and it's done, and your belonging's done, your sense of control is done, whatever it is that that you've invested in is potentially gone, and that's why we think it's the deepest threat.
And that's why people invented all these ideas to deny that finality, right? I mean, most living people believe that life doesn't end at death. That there is something beyond it. Maybe there is, who knows? But it's certainly extremely plausible that there's nothing and that death is the end. despite what people believe. And, we would view that as a pursuit of literal immortality, belief in an afterlife, which is the ultimate denial of death.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me a lot of Otto Rank's work that Yulon, drew upon a lot in existential psychotherapy, that sort of two primal fears of living and dying, and you see this happen all the time in the therapy space, where to become someone of yourself means to sort of separate yourself from the crowd so you can build your meaning, and this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. I'm cultivating a sense of agency in my life, but I'm no longer with them and I need to be with them to feel safe in the crowd. But then also, by being just in the crowd, I don't get to, cultivate my own ego. And, there's a quote that you guys wrote here. It was toward the end. I think I really, really like this. Somehow we need to fashion. I don't know which one of you wrote this particular quote, so I've just taken some of my my favorites. But somehow we need to fashion worldviews that yield psychological security, like the rock, but also promote tolerance and acceptance of ambiguity, like the hard place. To me, that's wildly affirming, because I tend to see therapy as that being the ultimate goal, to find some psychological stability, almost like helping someone become an ego that likes to die over and over again. But it does put you in a tough place, I think, because there are times when I feel really excited about who I am and what I'm doing, say, speaking to you guys. But then the more I lean into my individuality, the more existentially isolated I feel, and the more wanting I am of a sort of deep, like Christian agape love, of being just bathed in unconditional love. So I wanted to bring that up, because I imagine that this is a tension that I'm sure the three of you have had to sort of grapple with throughout your years of research.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I think, I think Tom, why don't you speak that, because we've written some stuff about the tension between freedom and security, and I do.
Yeah.
I really like the rock hard place thing we stumbled upon when we were trying to deal with 9/11, and
Yeah.
we were about the sort of after the effects of 9/11, and stumbled upon this rock versus hard place thing. It's very simplistic, but I've always found it to be heuristically, a value in the way you're saying, as well as in the political realm of
Yeah.
looking at different worldviews and different cultures. And yeah, there's no doubt that, and Becker talked about this too, sort of fitting in and sticking out, and yeah, he attributes a lot of his ideas to Otto Rank. So I think a lot of this does in fact go back to Rank. But yeah, Tom, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. There's, well, first of all, these ideas are influenced by Becker, and Becker was influenced by lots of other people, and they were influenced by people before them. Sort of a cumulative spreading and growth. But the thing just about the rock and the hard place. One of the things I've been thinking, I don't know, I think I've talked about with both of you a little bit, is we're getting old. We're around 70 now, and I would love to be able to believe that after I die, I'm going to go to a better place. That doesn't seem super likely to me, but it would be great to be able to believe that. And that would provide a rock.
I don't think we could find a worse place, though. If there's a place, it's probably better.
I don't know. I like where I am right now. I'm sitting in my basement pretty comfortable. Yeah. Well, to go anywhere, to be even, that'd be great. And if you can believe that, that's very comforting. That's the rock. That's a great source of security. And not everyone's able to get there. And in the political realm, there's kind of simple.
Let me argue with that. I don't think that's necessarily the rocks. I don't think that has to be. I think that has to be a rock kind of conception.
It doesn't have to be, but it is. It is a tradition I grew up in.
Right. Sure.
Right. And maybe the difference between Christianity and Judaism a little bit, in that in the Christian worldview, there's a pretty there's a definite afterlife. In my understanding, is it's different in other traditions. And I was just using it as one example, and even in even in the Christian tradition, there's much more complex, layered conceptions of what happens after death, and, whether there's, whether heaven is literally a thing or kind of an idea. Yeah, I don't, philosophers and theologians debate that. So yeah, I was just using that as an example, and kind of a personal one. I personally really would like to think that when I stop breathing, something better will happen, or at least something will happen.
At least something will happen. Yeah, good
Not
point.
something terrible though. Also, hell is a big part of the Christian tradition too, which is that's where we lose out there.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got a little sidetracked. What was I gonna? Growth.
Tom, you said something
Okay.
really interesting, if I may, just quickly. Like you said that, I don't know if people can necessarily get there, get to the hard place. I think one of the things that I also see is that people are trying to get away from there too, because the religion they were born into was very oppressive, which sort of brings in another tension here, like trying to find the right amount of religion for them, in a sense.
Sure. Definitely. I'm talking about religion without taking into account the complexities and the hell it puts people through. And most religions do that as well. But they also offer this promise that if you're a good boy or girl, you're gonna, something really great's gonna happen after you die, which is a really nice idea. It's I wish, when I was younger, I believed that. I wish I still could.
Right.
I'm not absolutely sure it's wrong, but I kind of suspect it is. I'm
Yeah.
not really sure about anything. One of the, what Jeff was alluding to was this chapter we wrote a while back about the interplay between growth and defense.
Yeah.
We call it fear versus freedom. It was in some ways inspired by George W. Bush. And sort of and the rock and the hard place, sort of the idea. And it was also an attempt to integrate terror management theories with other approaches that focused on growth and the expansion of the self. Self-determination theory was one variant of that in our world that we were really intrigued by. But sort of terror management in and of itself doesn't say much about growth. And this kind of gets back to one of the basic starting points, is that we're not claiming that we explain everything, and understanding the processes that promote growth and refinement and improved coping and competence and so on is a really important thing. And we think that's a really important capacity that people have. The challenge is that the care management system, consisting of our worldview, our self-esteem, and our current relationships, provides us security, so that we have these processes where we take in new information and integrate them with existing structures and process and act on them, and perhaps create something new, and maybe to some extent have the potential to create ourselves. The problem is that can move us away from our security, from our existing beliefs. It might be a belief in God. It might be a belief in a particular person who is our loved one who gives us security. It might be a belief in, for a scientist, we'd all love to think that our theory is like the ultimately wonderful theory. And, sometimes data comes in that makes you say, well, maybe there's more, maybe we need to rethink, maybe we need to refine our thinking. But that's challenging, because that involves admitting that what we have right now isn't perfect, and that opens the door to anxiety. So there's this ongoing tension between openly integrating new experiences and information, that's what's required to grow, and the security we get from our existing beliefs in our worldview, self-worth, and so on. This ongoing tension between growth and security.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a nice segue, Sheldon. I wonder if I could bring you into this. Like, to Tom's point there, can terror management theory, the pursuit of the theory and the intellectualization of the theory of death, or the denial of the death, in itself be one's own repression of their death?
Sheldon,
Yeah.
that was a point you made not too long ago when we were talking about our
Yeah.
own existential panic.
Yeah, yeah, I can't remember when that was, but we've been having some reminiscence of sorts. Here we are at the end of our uh, scholarly lives, as it were, and a lot of times folks have asked me, they're like, "Well, you guys have been studying these matters for almost half a century, and so." Surely, you have acquired some kind of ethereal psychological equanimity about dying. And I'm like, absolutely not. I'm a twitching blob of biological protoplasm, just cowering under the bed, groping for a large sedative. And that's because the the enterprise of terror management theory was in large measure an intellectual one. And while it was very rewarding and at times has infused our lives with a sense of meaning and value, uh, it was still a shock to wake up one day recently and look in the mirror and think that was the guy on the cover of Jethro Tull's Aqualung. And I was like, oh,
I'm
how those 50 years go by.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, totally. I think that's a big. I've certainly that was quite affirming to hear you say that, because I think I certainly fell in love with I read Staring at the Sun by Irvin Yalom.
Yeah, I love that one.
It's a beautiful book, and it was a pet of ours that had passed away, and I never thought I would experience grief like that. But I know that closeness is a very important variable to grief. Experience. And I didn't realize how close we were to him. He's this beautiful old dog. And we went through a massive amount of grief, Siobhan and I, my partner, for a good couple of weeks there. And funnily enough, you think it's a coincidence at the time, but I'm not sure it was, looking back on it now with, from what I've read from you guys, is that I picked up Staring at the Sun, and it really helped me. And it was a sort of bizarre paradox that I was struggling with at the time, because I was thinking, like, I'm sort of getting more into this feeling of dying and everything loving going away and all the people I love going away. And yet it's protecting me in a way. There's that quote in existential psychotherapy where Irvin talks about, we're all alone, yes, but we're all ships on a sea, and we can see each other's light from time to time. And there's just those brief moments of contact where we go, hey, you're here too, aren't you? There's a wonderful moment in that. Perhaps if we could move to some of the research. One of the things that I found that was really interesting from reading Worm at the Core was this difference between being consciously aware versus unconsciously aware of how the fear of death affects you. So could you guys sort of talk to some of the highlights of the research that you really enjoyed finding out? Jeff, should we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So we started out with, so it was difficult for us actually to think about how do we empirically assess some of these ideas. Because, from Becker and terror management's perspective, fear of death is a constant. Fear of death is in the limbic system. That's just there. I mean, that's part of being a creature, being an animal. So, okay, well, see, it's not really a variable. Well, if you can't manipulate variables, you can't really do experiments. And we somehow stumbled on the idea, well, maybe if these ideas were correct, that maybe if you make people think about their mortality at a conscious level, maybe we'd see an intensified clinging to one's belief system, clinging to one's basis of self-worth, clinging to close relationships more so. And so we developed what's called the mortality salience paradigm, where you just remind some people of their own mortality and other people of other negative things or neutral things, and then see if, in fact, when people are reminded of mortality, does it intensify their investment in their meaning system? If you're a patriotic, Australian, do you become more, defensive of Australia and more pro-Australia? Those sorts of things. And we started finding these kinds of things. And so, it was encouraging that it seemed to support one of the basic ideas of terror management theory, and that Becker posited. And a German thanatologist named Randolph Oxman tried to replicate our work after it was published in JPSB and it appeared. There was an article in the New York Times about our work, our empirical work with mortality salience, leading to kind of sort of more defensive of your worldview, that type of thing. And he didn't replicate. And we were like, okay, well, what's going on there? So we asked him about the details of what he had done. And he put people through like a 30-minute guided imagery of their own death and imagining being in a coffin type of thing. And we just had people answer two real simple questions about their own death that they spent very little time on, usually write a sentence or two on. So we were like, okay, so what he's doing is way more intense and powerful, and he's not getting
That's right.
increased worldview defense, whereas we were with the subtle reminder of mortality. What's going on there? That led us to the proximal distal distinction, which we then elaborated on. So the idea is that when you're consciously thinking about death, you just want to calm yourself down. You just want to say, no, I'm young, I'm fine, I'm healthy, I'm eating kale, I'm eating the latest superfoods, and you just want to stop thinking about death, right? And so you want to distract yourself from it or convince yourself that's long off, don't worry about it. Those are what we call proximal defenses. And so that's the frontline defense. So, if a terrorist enters a room, a building you're in, you're not going to worry about your worldview and, hold up a flag. You're going to like run under a desk or try to get out of there. So the proximal thing is more for when death seems imminent or it's right there in front of you. It's in your focal attention. And whereas the worldview defense and self-esteem and close relationships, that's keeping death out of consciousness. So a subtle reminder will tend to activate those things. And so we started playing around with that and looking at a stronger versus weaker mortality salience induction. And the weaker one will tend to have the stronger effects. So if you get in a car accident, you almost died. First couple hours, you're just thinking about, I need a safer car. I need to make sure I'm wearing my seatbelt, and all of that stuff. Hours later, maybe even the next day, death is sort of percolating outside of consciousness. That's when you're going to be thinking about, I got to really do some better podcasts. I got to get some more article. That's when your meaning system and your self-worth and your close relationships become more important to you, and you're going to bolster those. So that's sort of the basic thing that we learned, that there are these two different, and I like to say that basically the only thing that we added to Becker was that. And we just stumbled on that because if somebody didn't replicate what we were doing, we had to think about why that was and figure out that process of proximal defenses versus the distal ones. And Tom had played the biggest role probably in elaborating this distinction. So you may have something else to add about that.
Well, part of the inspiration was, I don't know, a long time ago, probably close to 40 years ago, we were at a conference and playing volleyball, and all of a sudden they noticed, Tom, what the heck, what's that on your neck? I had this grapefruit-sized lump. And basically, this is when we were really getting into terror management. It was just kind of breaking. And I went home and they said, well, you might be lymphoma. This could be cancer, and it's a bad one. And at that point in life, the most important thing to me was, doing experiments and getting them published in good journals. And I remember as soon as they said cancer, I stopped caring. I absolutely thought, well, this is nonsense. This isn't going to help me. It ain't going to save me if I get another article published. And all the things that I was focused on just became trivial. It struck me. I said, well, that's kind of interesting, because here I am looking at, actually dying, and all of a sudden I don't give a damn. What's going on with that? So I had this operation, and they pulled it out, and they found out it was a cyst and really not a big deal. And the next day I was thinking, okay, where's my computer? I need to write, right? So it kind of, I don't know, a few years later, when we were dealing with this failure to replicate from Germany, it kind of clicked that when you're actually facing death, when you're consciously confronting it, you have to do something related to death. You want to get the best oncologist, which I tried to do. You want to get more exercise and, quit smoking or whatever. And that allows you to think you're not going to die for a long time. But it doesn't deal with the fact that you're going to ultimately die. I mean, it doesn't, you know, even if you live an extra 10 years, you're still going to die ultimately. And that's still, beneath the worm at the core that's eating away. And when it's outside of consciousness, that's when you do the things that terror management theory initially laid down, cling to a worldview, try to boost your self-esteem, uh, emphasize your close relationships, because that's what makes you a person of value in a meaningful universe, not eating more kale.
Exactly. That was the
More kale, we like to believe, is going to make us live forever. So some of us, like me, still eat it, even though we don't like the taste.
You're doing better than me, Tom. I struggle with kale very much.
I have to convince myself I like it now, actually. Baby kale.
Baby kale, that's a nice compromise. That's like hard rock in a hard place, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Sheldon, what about you?
Um, yeah, I think that, well, I like Jeff's point that uh, we have often said that the only original thing about terror management theory is that we've never claimed that to be original so much as that we wanted to formulate Becker's ideas in a manner that was conducive to deriving accessible hypotheses. And I do think that's one of the uh, perhaps big contributions. Another one I've been musing about is the that I hadn't thought about for a while, but it was the rational versus emotional mindset studies that to me now map on to the Daniel Kahneman's distinction between fast and slow thinking. Another interesting result of failure to replicate our findings. You know, anyway, here we are, like in the middle of the so-called replication crisis, where a big chunk of psychological discourse has been dismissed on the grounds that it's not replicable. And anyway, we're as if folks in our day were not concerned about those matters. But as we've pointed out, we've always been focused on both conceptual and direct replications. And these two of our most perhaps unique findings were the result of resolving um, an incapacity to replicate it initially. Um, yeah, so anyway, I think that's another interesting domain that arose in that fashion.
I think that idea between proximal and distal conceptions of death. One of the things I really liked about reading that part of the book specifically was, I was actually sitting in a cafe just down here, getting high on too much caffeine, as you do. And it's almost like I didn't need the science to intuitively feel that that was correct. Like if I put myself into a situation where I'm running away from a tiger or I'm worried about something that's imminently going to threaten my mortality, I'm going to try to, I don't have any time to think about fucking politics or how I want to like become the best version of myself. I'm just trying to stay alive. But when I have this idea, this sort of, the rational idea, to use Kahneman's idea, like this rational truth that death is going to come to me at some point, that leads me to start thinking, well, what are you going to do with the time that you have? Which then leads me to the next question of how do I make something of myself? How do I feel like the time that I used while I had while I was thrown into a body, right, to bring in Heidegger was important and valuable. So I think that's really, really important. And I think, Jeff, just to bring you in here again, when you were talking about the initial researcher that couldn't replicate the findings, did you get into any insights as to the process of, you were talking about how death, he was using guided imagery and things like that. Was it, so I understand from that it's obviously a proximal reminder there. It's very conscious, but it almost sounded like a nice way, like a guidance into death, or was it like a stark, confrontation with death?
Honestly, I don't remember the details enough to say much about that, but I think he was trying to scare people, was my sense with that, which it can do.
Yeah, he asked
I
them to
mean,
imagine they had cancer.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
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 So I think, yeah,
What was that?
yeah.
Sorry, Tom?
Oh yeah, they were in the hospital, sort of on their deathbed, less than
Yeah.
5 days to live, and what would to get into, to try to mentally experience that. So it was, and it, quite reasonable. Usually more potent stimuli produce more extreme responses. So what the dose response relationship with everything, more input usually leads to more output. And our finding was that, well, in this case, it's less produces more, subtle death reminders. And then later, we found that you would think that immediately after being reminded of death, intuitively, that should lead to the most response. It turns out that immediately after being reminded of death, you don't engage in worldview defense. You try and convince yourself you're not going to die. And when it fades from consciousness,
Yeah.
so when it's not in your face, that's when all this worldview, all the terror management stuff kicks in, which is, kind of hit us over the head. Well, that's kind of what Becker was saying, that this is an unconscious sort of process. So we were, you know, through people not finding what we found, it forced us to realize that what we're trying to study was in the domain of the unconscious rather than the conscious and rational.
Yep. Yep. And Jeff, sorry, I cut you off there before, but I think even you can imagine sort of like the time. So like imagining someone, like if I imagine that I'm about to die, because I have, I'm in palliative care, I've got terminal cancer. I can like the time at which you're telling me to imagine that process might have an effect on what occurs to me unconsciously. Like if I'm dying right now, and then you ask me how this might affect, the measures, that would be different to if I'm dying in 5 days, or if I've just become terminally ill, so it's almost annoying, right? With like how many different variations of death we have to study here. But I cut you off before. I'm sorry, Jeff.
Oh, that's okay. No, yeah, I think one of the things that we haven't studied enough, maybe in a systematic way, because it's so difficult to do that, is people who do have a short amount of time left. But there's only so much you'd want to do in terms of any kind of intervention with those people, because they're just trying to. I did watch my father-in-law die last July, and it was a very eye-opening experience, and I saw what hospice was like. And I found it to be, the last few weeks, at least in this was somebody dying from cancer. They're hallucinating, they're in and out of consciousness, they're probably having dreams and thinking that's reality. They're in no place to finish their immortality projects, right? Like we're healthy, and so we were just at a conference, and we saw young people interested in our work, and that was very helpful for us in managing our terror, or just reading a paper. Or I was just told actually by a student I hadn't seen, a grad student I hadn't seen since like 1990. Became a clinical psychologist studying working with vets on PTSD, and he told me that CBT, these other approaches to PTSD, said that the best thing that's helped him help the vets was Becker and terror management theory.
Mm-hmm.
And that gave, that was very powerful for me.
Yeah.
Now, if I was a couple of days away, well, I'm not a couple of days away from death, but if I felt that I was,
Well,
I don't know if it would have had the same kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
positive impact. It would have been a concern, but being relatively healthy and us sort of, finding out that people are affected by our work, and even us just exposing people to Becker, which is really where we started. Let's just expose people to Becker's work. If that has a positive effect on somebody, that that's that legacy thing that we're all striving for when death is not imminent.
Yeah.
Or right in our faces.
Yeah. Yeah.
no, I just want to
Please.
just make a comment about some, you said there's so many variations on the way death impinges on people. And I think it's just important to realize that, we've been studying this for close to 40 years and we've learned a lot, but there's so much more that needs to be learned. There's so many questions that are not answered that we don't, if we're honest, we have to say, we don't know, we can guess, we can speculate, but, it would be nice to think that this is still in its infancy and that there's, in time, a much more thorough understanding of these things will emerge because there's so much that we don't yet know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another related thing that I've been thinking about is that when we learn something in psychology, if it's going to have an impact, a lot of times that impact takes about 50 years.
That's right.
So Freud's ideas from the 1880s and 90s became really impactful in the 1940s and 1950s. My wife forced me to go see the Barbie movie, and it talks about cognitive dissonance in a pretty accurate way. Well, cognitive dissonance was developed around 1950 or so. And it's sort of just now seeped into the way people are thinking about things. So yeah, what I hold on to a little bit is that, our stuff is still getting out there. I read a recent paper about ISIS, taking a terror management perspective on that worldview. And it was shocking and horrifying. But also at some level, it created distance in me because it was also gratifying that somebody was seeing how our work can help explain some of the ideologies that are spreading in certain parts of the world.
Yeah. Well, for me personally, this is why I was so excited to get you guys on the show, is that terror management theory for me in my life has explained so much of what makes me a human being. Like even you just mentioned ISIS there. I remember when I was doing my bachelor degree, I remember it was sort of 2013, 2014. I remember a friend of mine saying, have you seen this latest thing about what's going on in the Middle East with ISIS? And I remember like within 5 minutes thinking, why the hell am I at uni? Just this idea that I have like a path ahead of me that's ultimately going to lead me to this immortality project, right? What the hell am I doing? If they're going to come and, take over the Western world, what the hell, So looking back and then reading what you guys have written about and so on, it just, I struggled to not affirm everything that you guys are saying and sort of nodding away like that. You've written in the book here, this is another one of my favorite quotes. Acknowledging their truths, in quotations, inevitably calls into question our own. We have to believe in our own truths to sustain the precarious view that life is meaningful and that we are significant, enduring beings. Quote, one culture is always a potential menace to another, Becker observed. Quote, because it is a living example that life can go on heroically within a value framework totally alien to one's own. If the Aborigines' belief that magical ancestors metamorphosized into humans after becoming lizards is credible, then the idea that God created the world in 6 days and Adam in his image must be suspect. I was wondering if we could segue now into how each of you feel about what's going on in the world. Geopolitically, obviously in your country, with the election coming up and AI and all this sort of stuff. Do you believe that what's going on in the world right now is just as existentially destabilizing than what was going on in the 60s with the Bay of Pigs and so on? Or is there a greater degree of severity now? Perhaps we could start with Tom and then we'll go around the room. Tom, Sheldon, then Jeff.
it sure, it seems more intense right now, but it's important to realize there have always been conflicts. There have always been uh, people promoting ideas, and the 60s was sort of the aftermath of the Second World War with Hitler, and extermination of 6 million Jews, which was followed by Stalin.
Mm.
And of course, many countries, including our own, did a lot of horrifying things. Um, but just to me, the idea um, that a big chunk of our country wants to reelect someone who basically tried to overturn an election, which is sort of uh, the one of the foundational aspects of democracy, is mind-blowing, stunning, and constantly, a source of great angst. Um, Again, there are lots of difficult points in history. I think the world has always had things like this, but this is a difficult time.
Yeah. Sheldon?
Yeah, ditto. I like Tom's view. Evidently, historically, humans have been at the crossroads more than once. Pandemics are associated with insane conspiracy theories. There's been no shortage of, maniacs like Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great that exterminate uh, half of Earth. And yet, yeah, for me, I call it the fire and fascism moment. I do think that this is a potentially unique moment in history, in part because of the unprecedented degree of environmental change that in 1980 I was saying would affect our grandchildren, but now I've got to rectify that as we witness the melting of the planet before our very eyes at the same time that the average American is more concerned that there won't be enough chicken wings for Super Bowl Sunday. And so, yeah, we're marinating in mortality salience, yeah, and on top of everything, my current preoccupation is just with the AI and social media, because I think that is unique. It's no longer the case, just to frame it in terms of our country, but in the old days, the Americans may disagree about a lot of things, but we would actually see the same thing. Um, Very few Americans actually are exposed to the same ideas or information. And then with the algorithmically driven social media that is demonstrably responsible for increasing polarization, yeah, I think this is a precarious moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think just before we get to you, Jeff, I think to that point there, you can understand why there is this conservative ideal to be guided under one God, where we all have a stable truth now. And I think moral relativism is good because it sort of enhances flexibility, right? But then it's also, again, existentially destabilizing, coming back to your point there, Sheldon. So yeah, Jeff.
Well, yeah, and this is where I think the rock and the hard place, comes in. The fascist, extremist ideologies are a rock, right? If you can buy into them, then everything's going to be great. If Trump gets reelected, everything's going to be wonderful. We're going to get rid of all of our problems, which would be, the immigrants, and all the stuff that gets demonized by those sorts of political leaders. It's not anything new, but as Sheldon points out, we may be coming to a head with it because of all of the between AI and climate change, and and also there's just and the internet, right? So yeah, one of Becker's my favorite Becker points is that whatever we invent as humans will have a downside, a big downside that we won't always anticipate. When the internet started, oh my God, this is the best. We can get all whatever information we want. And now what it's done is it's undermined any kind of consensual truth, as Sheldon was pointing out. And that leads to even more of the extreme polarization. And I think that in the US, and I think this is to some extent probably in Australia and other countries, we're getting polarization on both sides. So that to me, I think the right is more destructive, scarier, and worse. But I think that the left in the US has become almost as insane as the right. And we've written, and I've written in some other contexts too, that it used to be that liberals in the US were really moderates. They were really kind of in the middle. And it was a hard place type of worldview. Whereas the conservatives were the rock kind of worldview. And now I think the US is mired in there's a rock on the right and there's a rock on the left.
That's right.
And then a lot of people are in the middle, but their voices are not really having much impact. And so it becomes and so if Trump gets reelected, it could be because of the rock that he represents, the right. America's always great, powerful, blah, blah, blah. It could be because of the left, which is rejecting the middle, which is Biden. And if they don't go vote because they don't like Biden, then they're going to help Trump get reelected. And so rock worldviews cause all sorts of problems on both sides of the political spectrum. So I think we're in that situation now.
Yeah.
And I do think that, I think that, people in the US, they're worried about the economy. They're worried about, higher prices for eggs and basic things and gas. They're also worried about crime. And of course, all of these things tie back to ultimately to death, right? You want to survive. And the more Trump can push that, and as we showed with the work spearheaded by Sheldon and Florida Cohen, if there's a terrorist act, if death is particularly close to consciousness as the election approaches, it tends to give the advantage to the politician who's selling the rock kind of worldview, which in this case would be more Trump.
Right, because that's one of the things I really liked about. I was interested actually in how you guys brought politics into this because, you imagine, a family from a low socioeconomic background where death it's a much more proximal thing, where they're struggling to provide and put food on the table. The hard rock is so appealing for them because they want that imminent threat staved, whereas someone who's relatively more wealthy and so on, they actually, it's almost like it's almost like you could sort of see it that and having the opportunity to cultivate one's immortality project is a privilege because death isn't so imminent. So I think I really enjoyed that about looking at these variations, as sort of expanded on before, Tom, but then in the political front as well, like which leader is sort of, whether they know it or whether they're aware of it or not, actually speaking to these different factions of death that might or might not be more appealing. I really enjoyed that. All right, well, guys, I know I can't have you forever. I'd love to get you back on for a round 2 and a 3 and 4 and up to around 10. But I wanted to sort of bring the narrative arc back into a sort of more optimistic and personal light for people who perhaps struggle with death or struggle with these existential ideas. There's a quote at the end of the book, which is, "Come to terms with death. Really grasp that being mortal, while terrifying, can also make our lives sublime by infusing us with courage, compassion, and concern for future generations. Seek enduring significance through your own combination of meanings and values, social connections, spirituality, personal accomplishments, identifications with nature, and momentary experiences of transcendence. Promote cultural worldviews that provide such paths while encouraging tolerance of uncertainty and others who harbor different beliefs." That is such a great way to summarize the book as you did. Do you guys have any further thoughts on that?
Oh, that sounded pretty good, but that's just us channeling, you know, Becker and Ronk and Yalom, Robert J. Lifton. Um, I still am on the waiting list for immortality, but it's good aspirationally. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Where can people find more about your work, books, your academic papers? Where should people go?
We're at the card.
I just send
is it
people
We
to
don't
my
have any
email.
websites.
People can, people can email us. I'm jeff@arizona.edu, and
Yeah.
happy to send articles, have discussions with people. I'm sure Sheldon and Tom also are open to any kind of interaction with
I
whoever.
like Jeff Allen.
Yeah.
Let me handle it. Look, that's fine, because that's building my terror management, right? It's like people care, people want to know.
Yeah.
We've got some value. Sometimes I punt things off to these guys. It's like if I think they're better suited to handle something, but we need, and everybody needs a sense that what they're doing matters.
Yeah.
Everybody needs that. And so worldviews that let people feel that way are going to be better, and I think you're going to have fewer mental health problems. And we didn't really get into that too much, but I think that there's a mental health crisis
Yes.
going on with it. It's partly the pandemic and the death threat underneath that, and the proliferation of different worldviews. So it's hard to sustain faith in any meaning system because there's so many being thrown at us
Yeah.
all the time. So it's a whole nother, it's kind of almost another topic for another time, but we've all noticed our students are having more mental health problems than ever before.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
We'll have to do that show, I think, to get you guys back on, whether individually or as a group together again. But that raises that whole idea about becoming the Ubermensch. Like, don't worry
Yeah.
about all these things that are forced down your throat. Focus on yourself, which can also be cause for more concern in itself. But guys, thank you so much once again for joining me on the show today.
Thank you.
thank you for having us. Really enjoyed it.